One of the largest working class organizations in the country, People's Action, is heading up a grassroots effort called Deep Canvassing, and it may be driving some of the shifts that we are seeing in the Pennsylvania polls.
People's Action director and To See Each Other podcast host George Goehl joins us now to talk about his efforts in rural America. It's great to see you, George.
Good to see you, George.
Good morning.
So, George, talk to us first about the work that you do. One of the reasons we wanted to talk to you, you have a progressive outlook and you're hoping that people will ultimately vote for Joe Biden. But you're one of the few people who's really been out there in the country talking to rural voters in more than like a 30-second way. You do these long, deep conversations with them to really try to get at what they're going through, what they're thinking about, what they're worried about. Just bring to us a little bit of what those conversations have been like this year.
Sure. I'll just say we started in 2017, went out to a bunch of Obama to Trump counties, and many folks who grew up in rural communities moved to big cities, and then Trump got elected and said, like, I got to move back home and talk to my people. And so we went out and had 10,000 conversations where we just listened, and we asked people, like, what issues do you care about? What do you think the solutions are? Which was our effort to not project a progressive solution on maybe healthcare, for instance. And then we asked people, like who and what do you think is responsible for the declining conditions in the community? And really interesting, and I think like right on for this show, while 41% of people said undocumented immigrants were a major cause of their problems, 81% of people said it was a government in capture by corporations. So we saw different strains of populism in play. And then we started to organize people on the exact issues they identified: healthcare, living wages, addiction, environmental justice, and we won stuff, and people were moving along a path of like waking in terms of like why we got to come together across race if we want to get stuff done. And then we kept running into immigration as being maybe a bridge too far for some of the folks we were organizing, and we started deep canvassing. So deep canvassing are like, these are like 15 to 20 minute conversations. Pre-COVID, they'd be on the doors. They're grounded in radical empathy, not judging people, actually being seriously curious about what people are up against and how they're making meaning of the world. And then we share a little bit about that ourselves. And our first experiment around this was testing whether we could help people re-examine their views on immigration. It ended up, we increased support for immigrants being included in, undocumented immigrants being included in public benefit programs by 20% from a 15 to 20 minute conversation on the door. So we think we're really on to deep canvassing, and now we're expanding that work into this election.
So here's something I'm interested in, George. What is it that you think the media and many others miss about not just Trump voters in general, and the rural voters that you spoke with? Why is it that it's such a misunderstanding? Because there's a caricature of, the Times, send somebody, they fly them out there and like they spend a day driving around and they quote some people. And it's almost like a safari expedition. And you're actually conducting this in a humane and empathetic way, which is what do you think that they are missing about that?
I mean, so basically everything first, yeah. I would say. And first, like, they're missing people's humanity. Yeah. They forget that though Trump won most rural counties, certainly majority white rural counties, that a lot of people there like rejected Trump. And a lot of people voted for Clinton. Way more people voted for Obama, which I'd love to come back to. Mm-hmm. And they forget that people are much more complicated ideologically than we might think. No, but nobody covered this. But during the Families Belong Together moment with this, when Trump created a crisis at the border by separating migrant families, there were 750 events on June 30th, 2018. It was the biggest kind of uprising around immigration in the Trump era. Half of those events happened in rural communities, didn't get covered. Like, there's a major outpouring of support in rural communities, including majority white rural communities, for Black Lives Matter, barely gets covered. Nobody covered this. Between 2016 and 2018, the two biggest swings in voting demographics, single rural white women moved 17 points away from Republicans to Democrats, and young rural white folks moved 16 points. But nobody's covering it. And I think like there's an over fascination, one with the Trump voter, and one, this kind of characterization of like everybody that lives in a rural majority white community is like a Trump loving backward racist. Right. And to be honest, in the larger progressive project, that makes our work so much harder. So, because a lot of things we heard from people on the doors, like, I want to be on the team, but it's not really clear that you all want me on the team. Well, and I don't know how we're
Talk a little bit more about that, because it strikes me that what you're doing is actually somewhat controversial within the Democratic Party and the progressive movement at this time, because there's been this view that Trump supporters are basically like part of a cult, that you can't possibly win them over, that you don't even want to talk to them or want them ultimately in your coalition because these are bad people that we just want to push, make irrelevant ultimately. So have you gotten pushback about the very idea of like talking to people and seeing their humanity, talking to them with empathy and really trying to understand what's going on?
Yeah, for sure. And especially out of the gate in 2017, we got a lot of pushback. And I think we were running up against kind of two basically lines of thought. One is like, those are not our people. We write them off. They're not part of the team. So that was one. And then the second was more of a kind of Democratic Party operative strategy, was like, no, we can win these white rural folks back, but we got to moderate our agenda. We're not going to talk about big structural reforms. We're not going to talk about race. We're going to dodge immigration. And even in some cases, we're going to employ dog whistle politics. And we said there's actually a third way. Actually go out, listen to people, find out what issues they care about, work on those issues. They're the same issues all poor and working class people care about. Move people on those issues, and along the way start to have conversations about racism as a system that creates different outcomes for different people, and racism is the main reason we didn't get together in the first place.
So I'm interested, George, as the Democratic Party, overwhelmingly the biggest swings that we see from 2016 to now in our polling is about college-educated whites, many of whom abhor culturally the people that you're speaking to. What do you think that that's going to have an impact in terms of the work that you're doing?
It makes the work we're doing so much harder. Like, I think our organizers in Alamance County, North Carolina, or deep in southern Indiana, or up in the thumb in Michigan, feel like they're always trying to clean up the kind of urban, progressive, elite narrative, and the fact that people really don't feel like they're wanted on the team, and they don't see themselves on the team. And I think one of the kind of misconceptions, like, yeah, there's a lot of white people on the Democratic Party and progressive team. There aren't very many poor people or rural people or farmers like that are seen as part of that coalition. So that's why we created To See Each Other, was to tell the story that is way more humane of people in rural communities, what they're really up against. People are really suffering, and they're coming together in ways that buck the trends and challenge the stereotypes. And we do two things. We try to move communications into the same communities that we're working on to help people understand why Medicare for All makes sense, why the Green New Deal makes sense, why supporting Black Lives Matter makes sense. But sometimes we think our biggest communication challenge is making sure that kind of urban blue coastal folks don't write rural folks out of the story.
I think that's so well said. You mentioned you wanted to come back to the Obama-Trump voters and some of the dynamics there. What was it that you wanted to underscore for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, one thing people don't realize, like, President Obama won 43% of the rural vote. Secretary Clinton won just over 30%. And if Democrats want to win statewide elections or federal elections, they don't have to win rural, but they can't get trounced. And they got trounced in 2016. So I think if you see movement among rural voters in this election, I think we'll go a long way. I will say what we hear from a lot of rural folks is that they see corporations that control government, corporations that are polluting their community, corporations that don't want to deliver health care as a major cause of their problems. And I think if you look back at the last 30 years, if Democratic Party leadership would have been more clear in naming who the villain was, there wouldn't have been such a big opening for the right wing to come in and say the villain is people of color, immigrants, Muslims. And so we just got to be better at actually being really straightforward. Somebody is responsible for the crisis we're facing, and it's certainly not people of color, immigrants, Muslims. It's big corporations that have taken control of our government and really don't care about everyday people.
George,
Appreciate your perspective.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yep. Next on Rising, less than a week outside of the election, the Trump campaign gives us a status report. That's when Rising returns.